Hello friends, my name is JJ. So today's video makes a provocative claim. Canada has failed. Now obviously on some level that is kind of a ludicrous thing to say. Canada is a very wealthy, safe, free country. Millions of people want to move here and we sit near the top of a whole bunch of international metrics for success. But countries are also more than just aggregate collections of quality of life statistics. They are also projects. Canada's modern founding occurred in 1867, and the Canadian founding fathers had a very particular list of goals that were supposed to guide their grand national project. The Canadian author Will Ferguson has a summary of all of this that I have always liked, and it goes like this.
The great themes of Canadian history are as follows: keeping the Americans out, keeping the French in, and trying to get the natives to somehow disappear.
And by that metric, which I think is a pretty accurate summary of the mindset that has governed Canada for much of the last 150 years, I think it is pretty easy to say that Canada has indeed failed. None of these goals have been demonstrably achieved. Indeed, if anything, we are now running hard in the opposite direction, which to me says something about the degree much of the energy guiding Canadian history has been wasted on the pursuit of objectives that were always deeply ignorant and implausible. But even if we think that some or all of these goals were dumb and indeed morally wrong, as I do, the process of abandoning them will be equally consequential. And that is what we will be talking about today. Why, after nearly 150 years, Canada has decided to stop living by this mantra, and how that decision might reshape the nature of this country going forward. So let us begin with the issue of the Native Canadians, because that is in many ways the oldest struggle of Canadian politics. Some might even call it Canada's original sin. Now, the history of Indigenous peoples on this half of North America and their interactions with the Europeans is a very long story that mostly predates the existence of any Canadian state. But when Will Ferguson refers to this idea of getting the natives to somehow disappear, he is describing the dominant attitude in Canadian Indian policy from the time of the country's modern founding in 1867 to, I don't know, sometime in the last 30 years or so, possibly even this year, for reasons we will get to in a bit. So one important difference between Canada and the United States was that the majority of Canadian land was colonized much later than the lands of the US. The year 1890 was both the year that the American government famously declared the American frontier closed, as well as the year of the massacre at Wounded Knee, which is usually considered the last of America's so-called Indian Wars. In contrast, the great era of colonization of the Canadian West only really kicked off with the election of Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier in 1896. This was actually something that the Laurier administration made a big deal about in their propaganda campaigns to get white settlers to the vast Canadian prairies. This idea that Canada was the world's last great frontier for white farmers looking to make a new life in the New World. The fact that they had to resort to propaganda campaigns, in turn, reflected the fact that much of Canada, as you might have heard, is a bit of an unpleasant snowy wasteland, as opposed to the much more inviting lands of the American West and South, which white pioneers didn't need any particular encouragement to stampede into. When American settlers flooded into these areas in the late 18th and early 19th century, the result was often horrific wars against the indigenous population, in which the US Army sought to play defense for whites who were just assumed to always be in the right, and the supposedly violent, savage Indians to always be in the wrong. There were times in which this violence against natives reached truly epic and even genocidal proportions, and as time went on, it did provoke some shame and outrage in parts of white North American society. Canada's great era of colonization in the late 19th century was informed by this, and was thus carried out in a manner that was no less imperial and racist, but also more smug and self-righteous, as Canadians are wont to be. Like the Americans, the Canadians sought to obtain Indian land through treaties of surrender, but the Canadian process was more cowardly and cynical. Government agents would persuade small groups of natives, rather than large indigenous nations, to sign treaties surrendering small areas of their land to settlers in exchange for promises that were often only made orally. And then once the settlers moved in, the borders of the surrendered territory would be arbitrarily expanded and the oral promises would go ignored because, hey, there was no record of them being made. The fact that there was no armed Aboriginal resistance to any of this, except in Manitoba, is often seen as a byproduct of the intimidation that many Indigenous peoples of this continent would have felt by that time, given what they had seen happen in the United States over the last century. The other important thing is that the late 19th century also represented a high watermark for a certain sort of Victorian paternalism and Darwinist racism. There was a lot of back-patting among the Canadian elite in those days that just as they had taken the land from the Indians in a more civilized way than the Americans, so too would they prove themselves better at assimilating them into white Christian society. There was actually a thinking at the time that Americans were too morbidly fascinated by savage Indian culture, and there would be none of that in Canada. Heavy-handed efforts to assimilate Aboriginal people out of their supposedly backwards cultures until they were no longer interested in being a distinct people was, of course, something that was practiced on both sides of the border. Ultra-assimilationist Indian residential boarding schools existed in both countries in an effort to kill the Indian in the child, as the infamous saying went, as did programs to incentivize Native people to leave their remaining treaty lands, and with them the special protections of the government. The following 1931 quote from a man called Duncan Campbell Scott, who was a bigwig in Canadian Indian policy during the 20th century, probably summarizes the dominant attitude well.
The government will in time reach the end of its responsibility as the Indians progress into civilization and fully disappear as a separate and distinct people, not by race extinction, but by gradual assimilation.
But Canada stuck with this approach a fair bit longer than America, and this is one reason why Indigenous relations in Canada often seem more tense and even toxic than in the US. Richard Nixon's administration in the early 1970s is often seen as the point in which the American government adopted an unambiguous policy of recognizing Indigenous sovereignty over Indigenous lands as a permanent fact of the American system. Nixon also formally abandoned what was known as the policy of termination, which was the idea that the whole treaty rights-based system for American Indians should be gradually eliminated. At almost the exact same time, however, Canada's government, under Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was doubling down on this idea that the separate status for Canadian Indians was something that the government both could and should eliminate. It was not until 1985, in fact, that termination, or enfranchisement, as it was more euphemistically known in this country, was formally extinguished as an objective of Canadian Indian policy. Now, a lot of people would say that Pierre Elliott Trudeau had perfectly defensible modern motives for pursuing this policy as long as he did. I actually made a whole video in which I discussed his philosophy about this issue, which I do think is defensible from an individual rights perspective. But these days, there is also a fairly broad consensus that Canada's leaders remained aloof and imperious about Indigenous policy for far too long, and that this perpetuated a legacy of distrustful, dysfunctional relationships. In any case, Pierre Elliott Trudeau's son, Justin Trudeau, is now in charge, and the other day his government passed what is perhaps the most sweeping affirmation of inherent Indigenous rights ever, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. According to the enabling legislation, it is now the goal of the Canadian government to take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with UNDRIP. And what does UNDRIP say? Well, it declares that Indigenous people possess an inherent right to self-determination and a right to autonomy or self-government. It also says that the Canadian government must obtain the free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect Indigenous peoples, including, specifically, their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, or other resources. This legislation has been heralded by many Indigenous rights activists as an important step in Canada affirming Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous land rights as a permanent fact of the Canadian system.
Basically, all the laws and policies that deny existing Aboriginal and treaty rights will have to be changed to get in line with recognition of Aboriginal rights and title and jurisdiction. That's going to be a huge piece. Because we've got, for example, 4 pieces of legislation: the Comprehensive Claims Policy, Specific Claims Policy, Additions to Reserve Policy, and the Inherent Right to Self-Government Policy are all currently based on termination of rights, title, and jurisdiction.
It is certainly a very dramatic rejection of much of Canadian history and early conceptions of what was once called the Indian problem. But it would also be naive to suggest that staging such a dramatic reversal of national goals would not be without challenges either. The Conservative Party voted against the UNDRIP bill, in part because they said that this whole idea of free and informed consent could be interpreted by the courts as giving Indigenous governments an open-ended veto over any Canadian initiative they dislike, especially natural resource projects critical to the national economy.
When a First Nation says no to a project, does that mean it's dead? It leaves a lot of unanswered questions and potentially the courts to decide that definition.
And it's a fair concern given that the Canadian courts have generally been at the forefront of expanding Indigenous rights, often in dramatic or disruptive ways. Canada's Indigenous population is not huge, only about 5 or 6%, a number that of course reflects centuries of determined efforts to make them somehow disappear. The fact that this minority may now wield disproportionate power is the ironic legacy of admitting the injustice of this failed goal. All right, now let us talk about the French. The relationship between French and English Canadians is obviously a topic I have discussed a lot in previous videos, so I will try not to repeat myself too much here. Basically, the quest of ensuring the survival of a distinct French-Canadian culture has been one of the central dramas of Canadian politics for centuries. The French Canadians, who are of course the descendants of the original French settlers who ran eastern Canada before the takeover of the British in the 18th century, comprise the majority population of what became the province of Quebec in the Democratic Canadian Federation that was established in 1867. And this was quite important since it essentially gave the French Canadians a secure political space where they could govern themselves and define their own destiny. The foreseeable problem, however, was that the French Canadians would inevitably start to think of their province as something closer to a country and would grow more, not less, alienated from the other English-speaking Canadians as a result of this high degree of self-control. And that, of course, is just what happened. As time went on, the French-dominated governments of Quebec got steadily more and more nationalistic and independent-minded. In the late 20th century, there were explicit efforts to remove all lingering traces of English rule and the English language in favor of creating a society that would be wholly by and for the French Canadians alone. The Canadian government has tried to mitigate this nationalism in various ways, most notably by encouraging the French language and French culture in the rest of Canada. But as we all know, this didn't really take. At one time, the idea of outright Quebec separation was the most overt manifestation of French-Canadian nationalism, and Quebec did have openly separatist governments for a time. But recent years have also seen a real hardening of Quebec's non-separatist faction into something that is not really pro-Canada so much as confident that the Canadian system can be used to secure maximum autonomy for Quebec without having to deal with any of the obvious headaches that formal separation would entail. And that brings us to where we are now. The current government of Quebec, under Prime Minister François Legault, says that he wants to pass a constitutional amendment that will, for the first time, declare Quebec to be the nation of the Quebecois people, which is to say the French Canadians of Quebec. The amendment would also declare French to be the sole official language of Quebec and the common language of the Quebecois nation. This would mark the first time Quebec was constitutionally recognized as being something other than just another Canadian province, and the legal consequences of this would be significant. Here is how Minister Simone Jolin Barrette describes it, one of Premier Legault's spokespeople on the issue.
It paves the way for respect for Quebec's autonomy, more collective rights for the Quebec nation. It's possible the Quebec government, the Quebec nation, can make use of these provisions to affirm its specificity in the Canadian environment, its distinct social values.
Now, at one time, this sort of thing was seen as very antithetical to Canada's founding purpose, which was not only about keeping Quebec in the sense of having them, not literally leave Canada, but also in the sense of being integrated into the mainstream Canadian democratic system, without any special rights or privileges. With the support of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Quebecers voted down a referendum on establishing a new so-called sovereignty association relationship with Canada in 1980.
That if present trends continue, the no side is going to win this rather handily.
And in 1992, again with the encouragement of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, all of Canada voted down a referendum that would have declared Quebec a distinct society within the Canadian system.
The no map is crossing the country with very few exceptions.
The other day, however, the Canadian Parliament voted 281 to 2 to approve Premier Legault's Nationhood Amendment Plan, and the idea has the full support of all of Canada's party leaders, including current Prime Minister Trudeau.
We agree with the province of Quebec on how important it is to protect the French language.
Now, what will this mean in practice? Again, we don't really know, and a lot of it will have to be hammered out in the courts. A lot of Quebec minorities certainly have some serious concerns about what it will mean to legally entrench this idea that Quebec is primarily a nation of the French Quebecois people, and what sort of discriminatory policies the courts will now accept as constitutional as a result.
Distinct society is a plus. We already are a bit of France in North America, so it's a plus. I think that many English Quebecers like that, like the Latin part of Quebec.
What we can firmly say, however, is that the declaration of Quebec as a nation represents an enormously important abandonment of a historic idea in which it was believed that Quebec could be kept loyal to the Canadian system that the founders established in 1867. The French are still in, but they have largely opted out. And lastly, let us now talk about the third goal that has defined much of Canadian history: keeping the Americans out. I like to say that in some ways Canada is the most anti-American country in the world, just in the sense that Canada's founders explicitly understood a rejection of America to be one of their central missions back in 1867. And to the extent that Canada is still not literally part of the United States, you can say that this country has been successful at honoring their goal. But on the other hand, this goal always rested on a fundamentally naive, if not deluded premise, which was that this country, located right here, could ever be fully capable of being independent from the larger US cultural, economic, political orbit. I say it was deluded because for as long as Canada has existed, Canadians and Americans have been a deeply integrated people, separated only by an extremely arbitrary, porous colonial border. Even if you go back 100 years, you can still easily find commentators making all sorts of snide remarks about how obviously alike these two societies are and how in denial the Canadians are about this fact. Here's a good quote from the great Canadian writer Frank Underhill in 1929, for example.
An honest attempt to enumerate the points in which our Canadian civilization differs from that of the United States is apt to be almost as brief as the famous essay Upon the Snakes in Ireland.
Have you ever seen the famous essay on the snakes in Ireland? It goes like this: there aren't any. Canadian policy for many decades tried very hard to resist the pull of the United States, pursuing policies to discourage trade with the US and promote a very Britishified flavor of Canadian patriotism that never really stuck. In time, it was replaced by a more liberal flavor of patriotism that tried to emphasize Canada as a progressive bulwark against American right-wingism. I have a whole video where I talk about all of this at great length. But despite all of this, the two countries and their people continued to have a very close relationship anyway. One of the most critical moments came in 1988, when the government of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney proposed free trade with America, which had previously been the ultimate taboo in Canadian politics. It was hugely controversial at the time, but it went through, and in the years since, it has been widely acknowledged as an objectively good thing that was quite clearly in Canada's best interest, given we were America's closest trading partner. So much so, in fact, that when Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump recently renegotiated free trade for a new generation, the proposal passed the Canadian Parliament unanimously. This was the same idea that had killed Prime Minister Laurier's political career little over a century earlier. Though casual anti-Americanism will always be an inescapable part of Canadian culture and politics, to live in modern-day Canada is to live in a thoroughly American society, awash in American pop culture and cultural traditions that are not only much beloved by the Canadian people, but often ones that Canadians themselves helped build. You can see this everywhere, from the abundance of Canadian stars in Hollywood, to the great Canadian inventors in Silicon Valley, to even the number of Canadians offering sophisticated commentary on American politics here on YouTube. But that said, unlike the other two issues we've discussed, there is currently no big proposal on the table to legally acknowledge the degree that keeping the Americans out has failed as a Canadian state objective. No great initiative to, say, encourage the free movement of people between the two countries in a way that would be akin to, like, Europe's Maastricht Agreement. But at a time when so many other age-old ideas about what Canada exists to do are being re-examined and rejected, I think it would be naive to believe that a closer union with the US would not at some point be equally likely to be embraced as a sensible corrective to the failed ideological assumptions of the past. All right, so that was sort of a long and philosophical take, eh? I do very much feel like Canada is entering a phase of considerable disunity and even instability, which I suppose is what you might expect when a country moves so sharply away from the ideas that have guided it for so long. But because these ideas were always quite ignorant and unrealistic, this also means that the next few decades may also be a time of great opportunity and possibility for this country. After all, it is only in the context of admitting past failures that we become the most open-minded about imagining future success. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you next week.